understand perfectly well what he was saying, because the woman who I was with would translate. He didn't say a word of English, but then he'd give me sound samples, and on the sound samples that were done on flute, the division of the minor third into a whole step and a semitone on that particular flute delivered an 8/7 and a 28/27. If you're a large whole tone, the 8/7, and then the semi difference between that and the minor third. When I heard the 8/7 played in a musical context that I could not ignore or could not dismiss as being, my whole brain absolutely rewired itself. I started laughing, and I uncontrollably at the psychic shock of hearing something and suddenly recognizing its true musical meaning.
Yeah.
And so I tried to conceal that I was laughing by looking away, and if he noticed that I was laughing, he did not allow me to notice that. And because he didn't want me to lose face, nor did I want, but however it worked out. But I found out later also in other contexts, in other Japanese films that I'd seen filmed, the same pentatonic scale would divide that minor third into equal parts, not the Pythagorean parts, so that there, on the shakuhachi, there was quite a bit of freedom on how you played the different pentatonic scales. And so that was where and I didn't know I was hearing the 8/7. I just knew that that was working. I went to the service club over at Tokyo one day, and they did have a piano there. I'm just sitting there playing some of my own compositions with my own strange harmonies that I would just transpose minor chords by a minor third and do things that are really forbidden, parallel fifths, all of the stuff that if you go to music theory classes, you can't do that. Well, of course you can. Don't be silly. But you can do whatever you want to do. And I was doing it. But I was sitting there playing some more stuff, and there's this poor young whack, or waving, homesick and sad, and standing by the piano there listening to me, just sobbing away. It's been so long since I heard any really beautiful music. Not to laugh at her, but then this fellow came along, would listen to me, and he said, I play on the harmonics. He says, I play the harmonics. And so I said, the harmonics? What are the harmonics? And he explained what the harmonic series was to me. And that was the first time in my whole life that anybody had ever told me that there was such a thing as a harmonic series. So I had clue number 2. I knew what the chain of fifths was, and I knew what the harmonic series was. At that point, when I realized I would still try to find the closest thing to the 7th, and the 11th I couldn't really do at all. But I did the best I could. But when I got to when I finally got out of the Air Force after 3 years, then it was the reason I enlisted, because ordinarily it would have been a 5-year enlistment, but they were just really gave a special for people who would go in there and just join up quickly. You can get out, and so I got out. When it was time for me to get out, I left, and then my immediately commanding officer, who was back there by New York City again, and I wrote up my own discharge and took it in, and he suddenly realized that he was going to lose his secretary, and I was doing good work for him. I would correct his English, correct his spelling, and produce a professional-looking document. And that poor fellow realized suddenly that he was losing me. And he called me into his office, and he almost begged me to stay. Poor fellow. I says, I've got to get to school and get an education. And I said, I'm not going to get anywhere here. Actually, I would have got somewhere had I stayed there. I would have just, if I'd been honest, I said I wanted to go into I want to become a pilot. And somebody pilot school, I'll stay under that condition, and then I would become an officer. At any rate, he realized that I should get an education. I realized it. So I went straight home to Rainier, Oregon, and I had my GED scores, General Education Development. It said Erv Wilson, he says, you are in fact the equivalent of a high school graduate. And so my mother got on the line and called up Uncle Howard, my Uncle Howard McDonald, who was then running Brigham Young University, and says, Howard, could you get Ervin into school there this year? And he says, well, send me his transfer, his records. And he wrote back. Well, it was nothing but his letters. And he wrote back and says, have him take a short course in this class. He needs one more class to take it. Have him take it. And so by mail, I took a course from Portland. Took the class, he went in, and she fixed me up to go to school over at BYU. When I got to BYU, the very first thing I did is ask her, are there any microtonal books here? And it so happened there was one fellow doing his doctoral dissertation.
Well, wait, you knew that label by that time? I mean, after you were in Japan, you knew what microtonal meant?
I knew what microtonal was because before I even went to Oregon at 15, I had read about the Indian scale of 22 tones.
Okay.
Somehow or other, way out there in isolated Pacheco, I got wind of the fact that the Indians had a 22-tone scale. And so I said, must find out about 22-tone scale. But so I knew there was a 22-tone scale.
So you asked if they had any microtonal.
So as soon as I got to Portland, as soon as I got to Rainier, Oregon, I found that I could borrow books from the University from the State University at Salem. And so I wrote in and said, do you have any books on music? And they sent me two or three references on Indian music, but none of them Fox Strangways and that set. But none of them gave the discrete descriptions of the ratios. It was just kind of almost bizarre gibberish, using strange formulas and so forth. But I realized that there was at least a chain of fifths at that time that went out beyond 12. And by that time I'd also learned that there was a harmonic series. at any rate, getting to BYU, knowing that there was a 22-tone scale, a perfectly viable 22-tone scale. Also in Mexico, I knew that there was a slightly flatted fifth. I could hear it, just a quarter tone flat. And I didn't know where that fifth came from, but I knew that somewhere, some far away, some Indians were singing that. People from American Indians were singing that lowered fifth.
Were there any key people at Brigham Young that enhanced that curiosity of yours?
The guy who had done his doctoral thesis, I went and talked to him. He said, yes, there's a book by Harry Parch up there. There's a book by Joseph Yasser. And there's Sensations of Tone by Helmholtz. So I went up there one after the other and got each one. And began working with them. And I was also taking piano lessons at the same time, and I had the unique privilege of studying with Leon Dallin, who was a very, very gifted composer. He finally took over Long Beach, the University at Long Beach, and but I had enough information then that I could figure out scales, but the calculation of the ratios was exceedingly difficult, and I knew in my mind's eye that I had to have a ratio. I had to have a way of making the octaves all equal in size, and a way of measuring them so that they would all be equal in size, that gave the octave as the unit. And my friends say, oh, you want it? And I had some notion how to, I had some notion of how to do it. I had actually somehow or other heard of the golden section by that time. I don't know how it was. But they says, there's this math student over there, and go tell him what you're doing, and he what you're trying to do, and I couldn't quite get it mathematically. And he sat down, and I explained to him what I was trying to do. He says, what you're doing is called logs to the base 2, and this is how you solve them. There is a great big book, this thick, up here, all of logarithms to the base 10, all written in, handwritten in, with so many of them that you can interpolate them to get anything you want in there. What you do then is you take logs to base 10 and you run this quick little routine on them, and they turn into logs to the base 2. So by hand, I began calculating by hand, and changing the logs base 10 over to logs base 2 up through 64. And those have been published, but I did them back at BYU. They were published much later than that. And that gave me having logs base 2 made some computations so easy to do. And just the more I worked with them, the more I realized what I could do with them. I think about it a little while, and all of a sudden I just realized that this was open sesame. And it put me literally light years ahead of all of my peers, and has kept me there ever since. The simple fact that I could work logs base 2, lightning quick calculations, and you know how valuable they are. Of course you do. And so then I began taking these logs base 2 and decided I was going to calculate. By that time I could go through the divisions one by one and find out quickly which divisions were going to have the best approximations to the harmonic series. And I went up there, and it says got up to 17. Oh, 17! Hey, there's some interesting things going on up there. I got up to 22. It says, oh my gosh, this is a miracle. But I kept on going, and I got up to 29, and it really looked good. And then some inner voices, keep on going, Ervin. Went 2 more steps forward, then got to 31. And completely rediscovered the 31-tone equal division, which Augusto Navarro was perfectly literate about and published a year before I was born in Pacheco. But I rediscovered 31 and began figuring out ways to use 31. But incidentally, before I stopped, I had actually calculated 41 too on top of it. I thought I'd better find. I got up to 41. I realized that's just not really bad. So then,
I have a question.
Yeah.
I noticed that there was a shift in this period of time from making music, melodies and playing chords and playing in bands, and suddenly the shift toward the scale itself suddenly took place during this time. Am I seeing that right?
I would always, when I would go up there, I was taking formal piano and lessons. I was taking the piano lessons from, first I studied with a certain eccentric piano teacher that taught me how to play something pleasant enough, but I wasn't happy with him. One day I was driving along, and I had the radio. I bought a little Crosby, a little green Crosby, and I picked it up down there because it didn't cost me very much money at all. And I wanted, I don't know if you ever even saw the little Crosby.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, you have?
Oh,
all right then. But I was driving it around one day with the radio on, and I heard this music I could not believe by Bela Bartok, a name that I couldn't forget. And so I dashed out and somehow or other got hold of his microcosmos and started playing the microcosmos on my own. And when I started, but later on I started studying piano music with Leon Dallin himself. And I told him about, and I had written a few things for Leon, had studied music with him, and he was, he rather liked him. And he was, but, so I said, he says, where did you hear about Bela Bartok? And I heard on the radio. But by that time, I had somehow hurt this finger right here. I caught it in a steel door. I had to work night work at a hospital, and a rowdy patient refused to go back into his cell, so I pushed the door shut, and the door shut and my fingers well. So I couldn't use this, so I started working one hand, and he started working the other, and we continued on through the microcosmos. But by that time, I was starting to make serious plans about writing music in 31. I'd figured out ways and keyboards and things and that so forth. And I'd figured out a generalized keyboard. And put it on a little piece of paper and told Leon Dallin I was going to write 31. And he was sort of cautiously, I'd like to hear you do some good things in 12 first. And I was just raring and ready to go.
How old were you about this time?
I'd been 3 years in the Air Force, and after the Air Force, I went straight to BYU.
Mm-hmm. So you're about 21, 22?
Okay, 18 plus 3 is 21. So I was moving into my 22nd year.
Okay.
And but I stayed.
So he said you should start doing some stuff in 12 before you do 31.
He felt like I should really try to write, and I had no way of realizing 31, but I decided to. There was somebody at USC who was very, very skilled in microtones, and I forget his name, and I decided I was going to come out to California and study with him. Got out here and I didn't have any money. I needed money, and didn't have a job, and I needed a job, and one thing led to another, and I didn't get over to USC. It turned out, I found out later, that the man was a hypocrite anyway. He wasn't serious about microtonal music. He just wrote that article because he was a good writer and he was being paid to write it. And but at that point, I had 31 down, and I began designing keyboards, and I found out about John Brock out in Compton. And so I set up the pitches and went right out to John Brock and said, "Can you make me a set of song bells to 31?" And I had organized one. The song bells are still in there in Emil Rich's warehouse. I haven't been able to get them away from him. He's retired into Hawaii. But I had a set of song bells to 31 made. And that was probably the first instrument of 31. And I was living down in Santa Monica. Before I actually got the song, I had the song bells by that time. But then I began thinking, I says, Ervin, I said to myself, I says, Ervin, probably somebody else, you don't just suppose that somewhere else on the planet, someone else is doing 31. It couldn't be, but I wrote to James Murray Barber and says, Dear Murray Barber, this is what I'm doing with 31. Can you tell me if somebody else anywhere that you know of is making music in 31? And he shot a letter back and he says, it is just amazing how two people in such different parts of the world can be doing the same thing. And got me in touch with Adrian Fokker. And I set up communication with him right away. Of course, he had his pipe organ in there and in Tyler's Museum, and they were getting together and giving concerts, and we finally got the Fokker, and so I was corresponding with Dr. Fokker, and he was a bit impatient with my keyboard, and I asked him what his keyboard was like, and he wouldn't divulge what his keyboard was like. But I'd had a dream one night. I just told myself I was all right. I'm gonna dream what his keyboard is like. So I went to sleep and I dreamt that there were just straight horizontal rows, and a woman was showing me the keyboard, and it was just horizontal rows, and one was expected to go by whole tones up this way and semitones up this way. And I said, that's ridiculous. And that's the first idea I had, and I would just reject it completely because you go off the edge of the keyboard. And besides, Bozanki is so much better. But anyway, I went up to John Brock, and he built a set of song builds, and I could listen to anything I wanted to in 31. The tuning wasn't perfect because he had to tune from vibration. He caught the master pitch, but then he had to tune from beats and figuring out with a ball on a piece of string how fast the beat should be and so forth. And he finally got a set of 31 that was fairly good, but when we really got it right down to measurings, after he built me the song bells, I had those, and I would lend them to Emil Richards, and he would use them in films.
This is much later.
Like Clute and stuff. And then I also had a 22-tone instrument built from square brass tubing, and had one of those built up. And those were used to make that celestial sound. And that guy, that Chinese fellow, what was his name, looking for his father. It was a whole series about a boy.
Kung Fu?
Kung Fu, yes.
Oh, David
Carradine.
David Carradine. That was for transfigured effects. They would use that as the translation. But at any rate, I got out here and I had the 31 tone sets and met Ivor Derrick, and he had and so Ivor Derrick began to introduce me around, and there were other people who were doing 31, but me and John Chalmers got together, and I, knowing the rules, knowing what I had to do a search for 31 is just an extensive search for good harmonics, cooperated with John Chalmers, and we did the equal divisions and checked to see how well they did the harmonics, up fairly high up in the harmonic series, and we went up to around 2,000 divisions, and to have the tables printed up there, I still have them, and we worked from that. But from that point on, we started. Well, it took. By that time, I started patenting, putting down on paper and patenting, pardon me, different keyboards for 31, and then an actual generalized keyboard for 22, which is your keyboard. Got a patent on that, and then we began exploring different ways to tune it and so forth and so on.